Hi everyone, I'm going to give you a quick tutorial here on how to get started on your abstract sculpture project. Take a minute when you get a chance to go online and look at the archive of projects from the past classes that we've done. There's all kinds of different ways to decorate your abstract sculpture when you get it finished. You can do any kind of design you want, painted in acrylic paints. You're going to use the acrylic paints to do this. And when you're done at the very end of the acrylic painting process, you're going to coat it with a clear gloss varnish, which seals the paint surface and gives it a nice glossy finish. So here's one that I worked on a couple of years ago that has an abstract dot painted design on it. I did some of this work with Sharpies and markers after I had done some painting of the bigger shapes. Here a student did a Dr. Seuss poem written in text on the surface after painting it and then coated it with the varnish at the end. So basically the tutorial I'm going to do today is going to show you how to get from having a piece of wood, a couple of pieces of wire, and a nylon stocking to having it stretched over the wire like this, and then beginning to coat it with a special base coat of paint called Gesso. That's spelled G-E-S-S-O. Gesso is a special kind of a thick paint that artists use to prepare a canvas for painting. And when we coat the nylon stocking with the gesso, several coats, nice thin smooth coats of gesso, we get a good surface that we can paint on. So this project requires you to help each other out at the beginning, especially when you're starting to get the stocking onto the form. You're going to get two pieces of wire like this. They're about this size. You're going to get a board like this with some holes that are already drilled into it. You'll see that the holes do not go all the way through the board. You're also going to get a piece of this mesh kind of sandpapery material, and you're going to use this first to sand down all of the edges and corners of the board on your table. It's a great idea to do this on a piece of newspaper and sand, rub hard, and it's especially important to sand down all of the corners. The reason for this is that the stocking is kind of fragile when we stretch it over the wire, and if the board has really, really sharp corners on it like this, they can tear holes in the stocking, and then it's really hard to cover those with the gesso. So we want to smooth off all the edges, all the long edges like this, both sides like this, top and bottom, all of the corner edges like this, and especially all the edge corner points like that. That's the part that really tends to tear the stocking. So you want to round that over really nicely. If you do this on a piece of newspaper, it's going to be really easy for you to clean up at the end. All you have to do is take this newspaper, gently crumple it up. You want to try not to get this dust flying up in the air everywhere because it's not good for you to breathe. Okay? Just dust in general is not a good idea to be inhaling a lot of that. So do this on some newspaper, and when you're done with this part of the process, you can crumple that newspaper up and throw it away. All right? Once you've done this rounding over to make sure everything's not going to tear your stocking, this is the hard part, or the tricky part I should say. It's not hard, it's tricky. You have this piece of wire, and the piece of wire will fit right into that hole. That hole is drilled straight into the board. So you need to get the end of the wire to go straight down into the hole. If you get it at an angle like this, or kind of sideways a little bit, it might go in just a tiny bit, but it's not going to stay in, and when you try to stretch it out, it's going to pop out on you. You want to be really careful about that. So what I like to do is kind of put the board right on the edge of the table, take the wire and kind of push it as hard as I can, so try to make it sit all the way down into that hole as well as I can. Then I can take the other end and I can find another hole and I can push it in there as hard as I can to get it all the way down into that hole. If it's like this at that point, that's okay, because now, being very careful to kind of hold on to the wire, I can stretch the wire so that it goes like that. And then I can get another piece of wire and I can do the same thing. Be careful not to just get a little bit in and then don't twist the wire, because if you twist the wire, what can happen is you can start to tear the material at the hole, and if you make the hole too big, the wire won't stay in there when you try to get the stocking onto it. It'll pop out a lot, and that's a real problem. It can start to give you some trouble. So push that wire in as far as it'll go, all the way. All right. Now, you can kind of put these kind of where you want them. This sculpture, there's a certain amount of chance involved in this. When you put the stocking on here, the sculpture is going to kind of spring into shape. You can move it around a little bit at that point, but then it's going to become what it's going to be. You can't really force it to be something that it doesn't want to be. And you would think, looking at this stocking that you're going to get, that it's impossible to get this thing around all of this. It's actually not if you do it and if you help each other to do it. Now, I don't have anyone right here with me now to help me, so I'm going to use a clamp to hold my board onto the table. You are going to get your neighbor to help you. Your neighbor is going to hold the board firmly to the top of the table while you stretch the stocking over the wire. And you'll see how this works when I get my clamp on here and I start to stretch. So I'm going to get my clamp on here to hold this in place. And I'm going to tighten this down really well so that this board is not going to move around on me. All right? And I can take that off later. So it's not going to move. This is the clamp is my friend in this case. In your case, it's the person next to you or the person across from you. Now, I'm going to start to stretch. I'm going to open this stocking up, and you'll notice that inside the stocking, there is a seam. I want that seam to be on the inside of the sculpture, not the outside, because it's kind of a rough seam. I also want to try to make that seam go along the edge of a piece of wire if I can. So I'm going to start to stretch this now. And it can take a little bit of wrestling to get this to work right. You might need to squeeze the wire together in places. And you will think at first there's no way it's going to work. But then as you stretch and you pull the pieces of wire together, you're going to get it to go across. Now, my seam here is crossing this wire a little bit. I have a little bit of leeway here. I can kind of fuss with that and try to get the seam to go right on the wire if I can. I don't worry too much about that. If I can, great. If it's too much of a problem, I'm not going to worry about it too much. So that's where you want to get it to that point. And you want to really stretch it so you have a lot of stocking down here where my hands are that I can still stretch around the base of this thing when I get it off the table. So your friend has helped you to this point to hold it down. My friend is the clamp, and I'm going to take that off. And now you'll be able to see how I can do this. Now I can kind of pick it up and very carefully and gently, I can take that stocking and I can stretch it and wrap it around the board. This is where I want to be really careful not to yank too hard, because this is where the corner of the board could create a hole or a run in the stocking. And if it rips a big hole in the stocking, then you're in trouble. Everybody gets one board, 2 pieces of wire, and 1 stocking. There might be enough stockings to give 1 or 2 people an extra one, but we don't want to go into I need another one with everybody. So please be careful about this part of it so that you don't tear the stocking. So I've gotten it to that point, and I can kind of, if I want to, I can kind of push it around a little bit. Like I can start to try to manipulate the wire if I want to change it. Let's say I want to make it a shorter sculpture. I can kind of push it down. Let's say I want to make it a taller sculpture. I can pull it up a little bit. I do want you to be careful whenever you're handling the wire to keep your hands around the base of the wire where it's going into the board, so that if you're pulling on it and you accidentally pull a piece of the wire up out of the board, it doesn't fling out and hit you or somebody else in the face or in the eye and cause an injury. We don't want to do that, okay? So I can kind of play around with this a little bit at that point. And then it is what it is, and it's become this wonderful thing. And I'm ready to start the process of painting the gesso. The gesso is this, like I said, it's this super thick paint that will go on in multiple thin, smooth coats. And we're going to see what this looks like when I start it. It is really, really thick. You can see by looking at this, right? Now I want to put this on in thin coats, not super thick coats. So I'm going to brush this out quite a bit. And I'm going to end up putting on several coats of this. I want to really, really stretch this out and make this really, really thin and super, super smooth. I don't want any rough texture on the surface of this. I want to try not to let the gesso create big, runny, goopy drips on the surface of the stocking. So I want to try and stretch that out as well as I can. If I get a lot of thick gesso on there, I want to use my brush to stretch it out. The gesso will stain your clothes, so please be careful and wear an apron. We don't want you ruining all those nice clothes. And it can be very hard to get off of your hands and off of the surface of the table. So working on a piece of newspaper still is a great idea to protect the table surface so that you don't get gesso on the table. And it's really important that you clean the brushes really, really thoroughly at the end of the period. Scrub, scrub, scrub. Get all that gesso out of there so there's none left in it. You're going to do, like I said, multiple thin, smooth coats of this. When the gesso is totally dry, you'll be ready to start painting. And you can just, like I said, you can look at past projects, or you might have an idea of how you want to paint it. You might see something. You might see a natural form that is created by the sculpture. And I'm going to, in the tutorial and in the archive, you'll see some examples of that. Like I had a student in particular who was working on it. She got the gesso on it, and she looked at the form. She saw a whale coming up out of the water, and she painted this beautiful orca breaching up out of the water on that. So, but it doesn't have to be a thing. It could be a totally abstract form, like mine became just a design with shapes and dots on it. So this is a really fun project. When you're done painting, you will get this special gloss varnish to put on there, and make sure that goes on a totally dry paint surface. That'll go on and it'll create a nice clear varnish coat, and that'll be your last project of the year. Have fun, you guys.